Blessed be the name of God. Today's gospel story is about faith. It's the story from the Gospel of Matthew when we are told that Peter, responding to Jesus' call and full of faith, stepped out of the boat and began walking on water toward Jesus. Suddenly, a great gust of wind rises up and Peter is distracted from his faithful focus. He realizes his precarious position over the storming sea and begins to sink. Traditionally, we read Peter's doubts lead him to sink, and so he desperately calls out to Jesus, who calmly reaches out his hand and saves Peter from the water. The sea in biblical times was usually a metaphor for the chaotic forces of the world. Through Peter's failure, we've been told that being faithful means to rise above the chaos around us and to stay single-minded in our focus on Jesus. Perhaps this would have been an important reminder during the time when this story was likely to have been written. Early Christians were being persecuted by the Romans, and Peter had most likely already been martyred. But Peter is seen as a fool for being so easily distracted. We're supposed to pity him and vow to be more disciplined in our own lives. Faith, interpreted in this way, is idealized as discipline. While I value intentionality, I'm bothered by this narrow-minded focus, especially one that ends up ignoring a troubled world. This way of thinking stands in sharp contrast to Jesus' life and ministry, in which he ate with outcasts, touched and healed the sick, and challenged self-righteous power. His faith, while disciplined, remained fully conscious and engaged in the realities of the world around him. To me, this interpretation of Peter's actions invites a kind of fundamentalism rather than faith. I've been thinking a lot lately about my understanding of faith as I observe the deepening political partisanship and growing economic disparities in the United States, intensifying, it seems, even more during this pandemic. As I watch the headlines pile up day after day, I become more saddened and frustrated by the widening divisions in our great land. The lives, the diversity of images, and the conflicting viewpoints of American people strike me as the stormy waters of the Sea of Galilee. Like the disciples in the boat, the safest thing to do seems to be just staying in the boat, afraid of the shadows and the ghosts. But just as Peter was moved to action by the approach of the ghostly Jesus, so too I become restless. But just how might we take faithful action? In rereading today's story, I noticed that Jesus never specifies which of Peter's actions were faithful and which ones were doubt-filled. It occurred to me that a different reading of Peter was possible. As the floating Jesus approaches, the rest of the disciples sit fearfully in the boat. But Peter manages to speak not words of recognition or belief, but a challenge. Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water. Now, this doesn't sound like an affirmation of faith to me. Rather, it sounds more like something my kids would say to each other when they were playing superheroes. Okay, if you're so powerful, then make me do something I shouldn't do. It's really a bluff. But Jesus sees right through such things and calmly calls him on it, saying, "Come." You might imagine Jesus chuckling to himself, knowing what was about to happen. I'm reminded of the many times throughout his life that Jesus calls people's bluffs. It's one of his common responses to self-righteous power. He confronts arrogance and self-importance with simple invitations, exposing the fear behind them. In today's story, Peter is invited out of the protection of the boat and the safety of his buddies to risk the churning waters, the chaos of life. Jesus doesn't try to protect him from the reality of the sea, but rather invites him smack dab into the middle of it. Suddenly, a wind distracts Peter and he becomes frightened. His fear is a sign of the unraveling, not of his faith, but perhaps of his self-righteousness. When our desire for control and power are surrendered, we're left face to face with the terrifying forces of the unknown. Stripped of his arrogance and posturing, Peter wakes up to the reality of his situation, surrounded by water, with nothing to hold him up. He dangles in the waters of a troubled world, faced with the chaotic forces of death and destruction, and begins to sink. So, when I read the morning paper or I listen to the news, I get that sinking feeling too. Like Peter in that desperate state, I search and I search for some sign for the power of life that is stronger than the power of death. Where's God in all of this? But today's gospel reminds me that my fears about our troubled world are not signs of doubt, my friends, but rather can begin a falling into faith. When we wake up to the reality of the world as it is, letting it wash over us like baptismal waters, we begin to be ready for what Jesus might be for us. As Peter is sinking, he cries out, "Lord, save me." No longer are Peter's questions to Jesus' identity important. No longer is he testing Jesus and searching for his own power. Instead, he simply reaches out for Jesus. I think this is Peter's big act of faithfulness. Without judging his actions to be the result of his doubt, we can see Peter's fall into the sea in a new light. Instead of desperation, we see his surrender to a fate tied to Jesus. Instead of doubt and weakness, we see him giving power to the life and the ministry of Jesus. Being faithful, therefore, means reaching out from the reality and struggle and pain of this world for a spiritual power greater than us. It means giving up our fear of the unknown and trusting in the power of God's goodness to reach in and through us. And it means that this power will not only save and change us, but our broken and our divided world as well. This is the faith that Jesus inspires. That is Jesus' invitation to us. This gospel story reminds us that Jesus never stops moving toward us, to those he loves. We're the ones he's bound for. It is he who pulls us out of the chaos. Ours is the boat he climbs into. It is for us that he calls out across the terrifying seas again and again and again. Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid. And the people say,